I went camping deep in the woods one summer, far enough away from town that there were no lights in the distance and no sound of cars in the night. The nearest road was miles away, and when I set up my small tent that evening, I felt that familiar mix of excitement and nervousness that comes when you know you're really out in the wild. I had chosen a clearing not too far from a creek, just enough space to pitch my tent and start a fire. The sun went down behind the trees, and the woods turned quiet in that heavy way where every small noise feels amplified. The occasional rustle of branches or snap of a stick made me turn my head, but nothing seemed out of place. I had eaten a simple dinner by the fire, nothing more than noodles and some jerky, and sat there until the last glow of flames faded into embers. The night got colder, and I crawled into my tent, zipped up the flap, and lay in my sleeping bag listening to the silence. The woods at night can feel enormous. You lie there and it seems like the forest is alive in every direction, but it hides its movements. I could hear the creek faintly, and every once in a while, a night bird calling in the distance. I drifted into sleep easily enough, but sometime in the middle of the night I shot awake. At first, I didn't know why. My heart was pounding, though, and the hair on my arms stood up. The forest was silent, not a single insect or branch moving. Then I heard it, a sound unlike anything I had ever heard in the woods before. It was like trees snapping, like wood splintering under incredible weight. Then came the thundering crash of something moving through the forest with sheer force, not caring what was in its way. It was so loud that for a split second my half-asleep mind thought it might actually be a freight train. But I was nowhere near any tracks. The ground seemed to shake as branches cracked and fell. Whatever it was moving fast, and it was moving directly toward my campsite. I froze, every muscle in my body locked. My tent felt paper thin, and I realized how helpless I really was. I could hear the pounding of hooves, heavy, deliberate, each one hitting the ground like a drumbeat. It was so close I could feel it more than hear it, like vibrations under me. I didn't dare move. My breath caught in my chest. Then, in an instant, the crashing came directly past my tent. Something massive tore through the edge of my campsite. The sound of branches snapping gave way to an enormous shadow that seemed to blot out what little light there was. I couldn't see details through the fabric of the tent, but I felt the presence of sheer size passing only feet from me. The air itself seemed to shift as it rushed by. The pounding hoofs thundered past, so close I thought at any moment they would slam into me. The sound of antlers striking branches and the tearing of brush followed. Then, just as quickly as it had come, the crashing faded back into the trees. I lay there in my sleeping bag, frozen, listening to the sound moving farther and farther away until silence returned. It was only then that I dared to breathe. My chest felt tight, and I realized I had been holding my breath the whole time. My hands were trembling, my skin clammy. My tent was still intact, though I had no idea what damage lay just outside. I couldn't bring myself to unzip the flap. Every instinct told me to stay still, stay quiet, wait for daylight. The hours dragged on after that. I didn't sleep again. Every creak of the trees made me jump. Every rustle of leaves had me expecting another burst of noise and force. The forest, which had felt peaceful before, now felt hostile, as if something too large for me to comprehend had passed through and could return at any time. I just lay there in the dark, staring at the thin fabric above me, counting the seconds until I saw the faintest hint of morning light. When dawn finally came, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, my legs shaky. The clearing looked different in daylight. At first glance, everything seemed normal. Then I noticed the ground. A deep, trampled path of overturned soil and broken branches cut right through the campsite, no more than 2 feet from my tent. The grass was pressed flat, dirt gouged out by hooves, and young trees were bent or snapped as if they had been twigs. That's when it sank in. A moose had come barreling through the woods in the middle of the night and had passed so close to me that one step in the wrong direction would have crushed me. I had heard before that moose had poor eyesight, that they sometimes blunder through obstacles when startled, but I had never appreciated the sheer scale of one until then. 1,000 pounds of animal had stormed past me in total blind panic, and if it had shifted just slightly toward the tent, I would have been nothing more than a crumpled mess under its weight. I walked the path it had left, following the broken saplings and flattened grass. The trail cut straight through my sight and then curved off toward the creek, disappearing into the deeper woods. There were fresh prints in the mud by the water, huge, distinct tracks that left no doubt about what I had heard. Standing over them, the size of those hooves compared to my boot made me swallow hard. The rest of the morning, I couldn't shake the thought. I kept replaying the moment when the sound of that massive body tore past my tent. How the ground had vibrated. How close I had been to being trampled without the animal even knowing I was there. I had thought of bears before, thought of coyotes or wolves when camping alone, but I had never once truly considered the danger of a moose in the dark. I packed up slowly, every movement careful, as if the forest itself had changed overnight. The air seemed sharper, the light harsher, and I felt exposed in a way I hadn't before. When I rolled up my tent and saw again how near the tracks were, it made my chest tighten. The distance was laughably small, 2 feet, maybe less. The margin between me waking up safe and me never waking up at all was just a few steps of a panicked animal. As I hiked out that day, the forest didn't feel as friendly. Every sound made me turn my head. Every broken branch in the distance had me thinking of that freight train noise in the night. I realized then that camping, as peaceful as it can feel, is always balanced on a knife's edge of chance. You're never really in control out there. You're a guest in something's home, and sometimes that something is larger and more dangerous than you're ready for. By the time I reached the road, the daylight had washed some of the fear out of me, but not the lesson. I had been no more than 2 feet away from being crushed in my sleep, and the moose hadn't even known I existed. It hadn't been malice, just chance. That thought stayed with me, heavier than any ghost story or imagined fear. In the end, it wasn't shadows or strange noises that nearly ended me. It was just a massive, half-blind animal trying to make its way through the night. And that is what I carried home from that trip. The memory of lying in a tent, helpless as a freight train of muscle and antlers thundered by, and the knowledge that sometimes survival in the woods comes down to nothing more than blind luck. I had been to the desert plenty of times, but there was something about camping out there that always kept me uneasy. The wide open spaces, the way the air cooled so fast at night, the silence that was broken only by the buzzing of insects or the occasional rustle of something moving through the brush. It all carried a weight to it. It wasn't like camping in a forest where you had the comfort of tall trees and shaded canopies, or the sound of streams and birds to fill the emptiness. In the desert, everything was exposed, and it felt like even when you thought you were alone, you weren't really. There was always something living out there, hidden in plain sight, moving silently under the hot sun or the moonlight. That's where I found myself one weekend. I had set up my little one-man tent near Sabino Canyon, just outside Tucson. I'd been working long hours, and I thought a night out under the stars would clear my head. The campsite was pretty basic, just a flat sandy spot not far from the trailhead, with my car parked close enough that I could reach it if I needed. I packed light: a tent, a sleeping bag, some food, and a few gallons of water. I wasn't planning on being out more than a night or two. By late afternoon, the sun was brutal, reflecting off every pale rock and strip of sand like the whole place had been polished. I sat in the thin patch of shade cast by a mesquite tree, sweating even while doing nothing. The stillness was heavy, like the world was holding its breath. Occasionally a cicada would start buzzing in the distance, but otherwise the air was almost too quiet. As evening came on, the heat finally began to loosen its grip. The desert transformed in that short window. Shadows stretched long, the light softened, and the whole place looked less like a giant oven and more like something alive. I cooked a simple meal on my camp stove, ate quietly, and thought about taking a walk down the nearby trail before it got too dark. Something about stretching my legs felt good after sitting in the heat all day. So I set out on the trail. The desert dusk is strange. It's not like a switch flipping from day to night. The light lingers, gets hazy, and plays tricks on your eyes. The plants look sharper, the rocks throw odd shadows, and everything feels like it's moving just slightly, even when it isn't. I was a mile or so from camp when I noticed movement up ahead. At first, I thought it was another hiker heading back to the parking lot. I squinted, adjusting to the light, and the figure became clearer. But the more I looked, the stranger it seemed. Whoever it was, they weren't wearing clothes. Not a stitch. I slowed down, unsure if I should keep going. The figure was a man, tall, thin, with a kind of awkward gait. His skin caught the last bit of sunlight, a reddish bronze from exposure. He didn't seem to notice me at all. He just walked with a determined pace, bare feet stepping over rocks and sand like it didn't bother him. His shoulders were hunched, arms swinging loosely. The sight of him sent a chill through me, even though it was still warm out. There's something deeply unsettling about seeing someone totally naked where they clearly shouldn't be. It strips away every normal boundary. My first thought was, what if he's dangerous? People in the desert do strange things sometimes: heat stroke, drugs, mental breaks. And here I was, alone, with nothing but the trail between us. I stepped off the path quietly and crouched behind a stand of prickly pear. My heart thudded in my chest as I watched him come closer. He didn't look at me, didn't change his pace, didn't even seem aware that I was there. He just kept walking, eyes forward, face hard and expressionless. There was no hesitation in him, like he had somewhere important to be. I stayed crouched until he passed, and only when he was a good distance away did I stand up again. My hands were shaking. The thought hit me, what if he was camping near me? What if I just stumbled across some nudist group tucked away in the canyon? The whole idea of running into more people like him made my stomach twist. I turned back toward camp, moving quicker than before. Every little sound in the brush felt louder, sharper. I kept picturing the man's bare feet stepping over rocks, how unconcerned he seemed with the thorns, the snakes, the sheer brutality of walking naked in the desert. Who does that? And why here, of all places? Back at camp, the air had cooled, and the stars were starting to show. I lit a small fire and sat close to it, trying to shake off the unease. But my mind kept replaying what I'd seen. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe just some eccentric person out here who liked to hike that way. But the way he looked, the grim set of his face, the total lack of acknowledgement, none of it felt right. I barely slept that night. Every rustle outside the tent made me stiffen. At one point, I swore I heard footsteps on the trail near camp. I lay perfectly still, holding my breath, listening. The steps came slow, crunching lightly on the sand and rock, then faded into silence. Maybe it was just an animal, I told myself, but the sound had been too steady, too deliberate. The next morning, I packed up earlier than planned. The air was cool and crisp, but I couldn't enjoy it. I just wanted to be back in town, surrounded by people and noise. On the way out, I passed a small sign I hadn't noticed before. It was faded, half buried in weeds, but the words were still legible. Private land, nudist area, keep out. That explained it. It was just a colony nearby, tucked into the canyon, probably harmless. But that didn't erase the way it felt to see that man walking alone out there, naked and silent, like he belonged to the desert in some way I couldn't understand. It made me realize how vulnerable I'd been, how easily things could have gone differently if he hadn't just walked past. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief. The desert stretched behind me, wide and empty, and I couldn't shake the thought that somewhere out there, people were living by their own rules, stripped down to nothing in a place that didn't forgive mistakes. I drove away that morning knowing I'd probably never camp in that canyon again. Not because of animals or the heat or even the risk of getting lost, but because sometimes the scariest thing you can stumble across out in the wild isn't nature, it's people. I've spent a lot of time in the desert, camping in southern Arizona, hiking trails, baking under the sun, and dealing with the kind of silence that only the desert can give you. Out there, sound doesn't travel the same way it does in a forest. In the desert, a small pebble rolling can sound like something huge moving. A rustle in the brush can raise your heartbeat. The air carries everything sharper. There's no room for your mind to rest easy, not when every noise echoes and every shadow stretches. That's where I was when all of this happened, Sabino Canyon, just northeast of Tucson. I've been there before. It's a beautiful place, full of trails, canyons, waterfalls when the water's running, and tall saguaro that stand like sentries against the mountains. But it's also a place where you feel exposed. There aren't dense trees to hide under. There's little cover. It's you, the sand, the rocks, and the open sky. That weekend I had gone camping with my parents. We'd found a spot just off one of the smaller trails, tucked between a few mesquite trees where there was enough shade to pitch our tent without baking alive in the day. The desert can be brutal in the afternoon, but once the sun dips, the cool air sinks down into the canyon and you can hear coyotes yipping in the distance. It's peaceful if you can handle the extremes. The first night was fine. We set up camp, cooked some food over a small fire, and listened to the desert settle down. I fell asleep easily, wrapped in my bag, the tent flapping lightly with the breeze. By morning, though, tension was already brewing. My parents were arguing. I don't even remember what it was about. It was one of those low, sharp arguments that sticks under your skin even if you're not the one involved. My dad was trying to manage the camp stove and get coffee going, and my mom was clearly fed up with something. The mood was heavy. After breakfast, I tried to stay out of it, busying myself with packing my day pack for a hike. My mom, though, had reached her limit. I remember she stood up quickly, brushed the dirt from her pants, and without much of a word, started walking down one of the trails alone. She needed space, that was obvious, and my dad didn't follow her. He just shook his head and muttered something under his breath. I figured she'd cool off and come back in an hour or two. The trails in Sabino aren't usually confusing. They're dry, rocky, and mostly open. You can see for quite a distance ahead in many places. What none of us realized, though, was how strange that canyon can feel when you're by yourself. Later, when she told me her side of it, I pieced together what happened. She had walked for maybe half a mile down the dusty trail. The sun was high, the heat rising off the rocks, and the cicadas buzzing in the brush. She said she was trying to calm her breathing, pushing away the leftover anger. She had her hat on, a water bottle in her hand, and nothing else. No pack, no phone, no way to really keep track of time. Just her and the trail. The farther she went, the quieter it got. The cicadas dropped off, and the wind died down. That's when she saw him. She said he appeared maybe 50 yards ahead, coming around a bend. At first, she thought her eyes were playing tricks on her because of the shimmer of heat rising off the rocks. Then the figure got clearer, and she realized it was a man. But not just a man, he was completely naked. Bare skin, tanned from the sun, dust coating his legs, no shoes, no hat, nothing. She froze on the trail. He didn't make eye contact. He didn't slow down. He just walked toward her with this hard, angry look on his face, not directed at her, but like he was carrying a weight, like he was storming somewhere with purpose. His steps were heavy, deliberate, his arms swinging stiffly by his sides. His face, she said, looked harsh, brows drawn down, lips pressed tight, eyes locked on some invisible point in front of him. When she told me this, she admitted that for a moment she thought maybe she had stumbled onto some kind of unmarked area, some nudist colony out in the desert that no one talks about. She didn't know what to do. He didn't say anything, didn't acknowledge her at all. He just walked right past her like she didn't exist. She pressed herself off the side of the trail, close to a prickly pear cactus, trying not to make contact. She said she could hear his breathing as he passed, deep, sharp breaths, like he was working hard to hold something in. His skin smelled like sweat and sun, sharp and sour in the heat. She held her breath until he was 10 feet past her, then 20. She expected him to keep going, to vanish around the next bend, but instead, he slowed. She swore he didn't look back. He just stopped walking for a second, tilted his head up toward the ridge like he was listening for something, and then he kept going. His back was broad, his shoulders burned red from the sun, and his feet kicked up little puffs of dust as he went. That's when the fear really hit her. He wasn't some harmless hiker who lost his clothes for a joke. There was something unsettling in the way he moved, the tension in his body. He looked angry at something she couldn't see, and the fact that he had no gear, no water, nothing to protect himself in that heat, made it even worse. People don't survive long out there without preparation. She waited until he was far enough away, then turned around fast and headed back toward camp. She said every step felt heavy, her skin prickling, half expecting him to turn and follow her. The silence of the canyon was crushing. She couldn't hear anything but her own footsteps crunching in the dirt and the pounding of her heart. When she finally came back into view of the campsite, she said she almost cried with relief. My dad was still there, sitting in his chair, drinking coffee like nothing had happened. She didn't tell him right away. She just sat down, shaken, and tried to pull herself together. I didn't know any of this until later, when she told me the story herself. But what stuck with me was the thought of being out there alone on a trail with someone like that. A naked, angry man, wandering in the heat, not speaking, not reacting, just pushing past like you weren't even real. I thought about it for days afterward. Who was he? Where did he come from? Was he part of some nudist colony tucked away in the desert hills? Or was he just some unwell drifter, cooked by the sun and lost in his own head? The idea that he could survive out there barefoot made my stomach twist. The ground alone is enough to blister your feet by noon. The cactus spines, the sharp rocks, the scalding dust. It eats at you, and yet he walked like none of it touched him. What scared me most wasn't that he ignored her. It was how close it came to being something else. What if he had stopped? What if he had decided to acknowledge her? Out there, with no one else around, no cell service, no quick way back, it could have gone bad in an instant. Later, we heard from someone else in Tucson that Sabino Canyon has had its share of strange encounters. It's close enough to town that all kinds of people wander in. Some are just hikers. Some are drifters. Some are out there hiding from something. There are stories of people living off the land in little hidden camps, avoiding contact, slipping in and out without anyone noticing. That naked man, whether he belonged to a nudist group or was just someone who'd snapped, fit into that category. Someone who didn't follow the rules of normal life anymore. Someone unpredictable. It's been years since that trip, but every time I think about camping in southern Arizona again, I picture him. That bare skin covered in dust, that angry look, the way he didn't care about the heat or the rocks or anyone else. Just a body moving through the canyon with purpose, like nothing in the world could stop him. And the desert, vast and empty, swallowed him whole. That's what makes it scary. It's not ghosts, it's not monsters. It's people, real people, out in the middle of nowhere, where no one can hear you. They can be the most unpredictable thing of all. I've camped enough times to know that the woods have a way of humbling you. You think you're prepared, you think you know what dangers to expect, and then something happens that strips away all that confidence. For me, that moment came the night I realized just how terrifying a moose can really be. People talk a lot about bears when they talk about camping, especially black bears. They're strong, unpredictable, and quick to make trouble around food. But I've always thought, and still think, that I'd rather face down a black bear than get too close to a moose. A bear can be dangerous, yes, but a moose is raw muscle, bone, and instinct. They're bigger, meaner looking, and when one decides you're in its way, you're nothing but a target. That trip started out like any other. I had gone deep into the woods, far enough that cell service dropped out and the road was nothing but a memory. I wanted that kind of isolation. I found a clearing near a marshy stretch where I could hear frogs croaking and birds calling as the sun went down. Felt perfect. I pitched my tent on the high ground, gathered wood, and built a small fire. I kept my food tied up well away from camp because black bears were the only thing on my mind at the time. I didn't even think about moose. The evening was calm. The fire cracked softly. The mosquitoes were kept at bay by the smoke, and the sky turned from pale orange to black, full of stars. I sat there for a while, letting my eyes adjust to the dark. Every shadow between the trees seemed to move at the edge of my vision, but that's how the forest always feels at night. I ate a small meal, sat a bit longer, and finally zipped myself into the tent. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. At first, it was the sound that brought me out of sleep. Low, heavy thuds, like the ground itself was being punched. Then came the sound of branches snapping, brush tearing. It wasn't distant. It was close, way too close. I lay still, trying to slow my breathing. What I heard next made my stomach twist. the sharp exhale of something enormous, followed by another stomp. Then another. The ground shook just slightly, but enough to make me feel the weight of whatever it was. It circled the area slowly, heavy steps pressing down into the soil. It wasn't a bear. I knew that almost immediately. A bear's movements have a different rhythm, lighter somehow even when they're large. This was something taller, longer. I remembered then where I had set up camp. The marshland nearby, moose country. My heart kicked harder in my chest. Of all the things to stumble across my tent, it had to be a moose. I didn't dare move. The fabric of my tent suddenly felt like nothing. I could almost picture the massive body towering above it, long legs, huge shoulders, and those broad antlers that could swing like weapons. I had heard before that moose can kill more people than bears in some regions, simply because they're so aggressive when startled or threatened. I thought about what would happen if it decided my tent was something in its way. I could already see myself shredded, trampled flat, strung up on antlers without the animal even knowing it had done it. The moose came closer. I could hear the snort of its breath, the shifting of brush as it pushed through. At one point, its hoof struck something hard, a fallen branch, and the crack of it sounded like a gunshot in the night. My whole body tensed. I stayed as still as I could, barely breathing. The moose stopped for a moment, and all I could hear was that slow, heavy breathing just outside. I imagined its huge head turning, ears twitching, trying to make sense of the strange shape in its territory. I had read before that their eyesight wasn't good, but their hearing was sharp, and I knew one wrong move, one zipper pulled too fast, one gasp too loud, could send it into a rage. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The animal shifted, hooves grinding into the dirt, antlers scraping against branches as it moved. Then came a loud grunt, guttural and deep. My body turned cold at the sound. It was the kind of noise that stripped away every thought, leaving only fear. Suddenly, it stomped hard once, then again. The ground shook. I thought that was it, that the next sound would be my tent collapsing under 1,000 pounds of angry muscle. But then, just as suddenly, it turned. The stomping moved away, back toward the marsh, the sound fading slowly with each long step. The snapping of branches grew weaker, then disappeared into the distance. I didn't move until the silence was absolute again. Even then, I lay frozen for the rest of the night, wide awake, my heart refusing to calm down. Every noise set me on edge. Every gust of wind sounded like its return. When the first light of morning came, I crawled out of my tent, weak in the knees. The clearing told the story of what had happened. The ground was ripped up with hoof prints, huge, deep impressions that looked unreal in size. Brush and saplings had been bent and broken, as if something had stormed through with no regard for what stood in its path. Just feet from my tent, the earth was trampled down flat. If it had taken a few steps in a different direction, the tent would have been directly under that path. I followed the trail down toward the marsh, each hoofprint sinking deep into the mud. They were the kind of tracks you could set your whole hand inside. Standing there, looking at them, I felt smaller than I ever had before in the woods. I thought about how a black bear, for all its power, still seems like something I could fight against if pushed to the edge, scream, throw rocks, stand tall, maybe make it back alive. But a moose? There's nothing to fight. It's bigger than a horse, angrier than anything, and all you can do is hope it doesn't decide to come through you instead of past you. The rest of that day, I couldn't shake it. Even as the sun rose higher, even as the marsh steamed and the birds sang, the image stayed in my mind. A shredded body tangled in antlers, bones crushed under hooves, and all of it happening without the animal meaning anything by it. It wouldn't be an attack. It would just be the blind force of something too powerful, too large, passing through. When I packed up and left, I felt relief heavier than I ever had before on a hike. It wasn't just the normal comfort of heading home. It was the relief of having lived through something I had no control over. I had been a few feet from death, and the only reason I wasn't torn apart or trampled flat was because a moose had chosen, at the last moment, a different direction. That's the part that has stayed with me the most. It wasn't a choice I made or any survival skill I pulled from memory. It was pure chance. The moose walked past me instead of through me, And that single accident was the line between my life continuing and it ending in a blur of hooves and antlers. And that's why, even now, I'll tell anyone who asks. I'd rather face a black bear in the woods than cross paths with a moose. A bear feels dangerous, but a moose feels unstoppable. The night I spent frozen in my tent while one circled close was proof enough. That close brush showed me how fragile we really are in the wild, and how quickly the forest can remind you of the sheer scale of what lives out there alongside us. I've been in the woods most of my life, and I've had my share of close calls. But there was one night that stuck with me more than almost anything else. It was one of those trips that started out like 100 others. Pack on my back, tent strapped tight, the plan being to get away from everything for a couple of nights. The hike in had been long but manageable, and I picked a spot near the bottom of a ridge, tucked back from the trail, where I could settle in for the evening. I had water close by, firewood scattered in all directions, and enough flat ground to pitch my small tent. By the time the sun sank behind the trees, I felt like I had done everything right. The forest at night always carries that weight. Deep quiet with little sounds breaking it here and there. A snapping twig, the soft shuffle of small animals in the brush, the faint whistle of wind through the trees. You get used to it, though. I had my dinner, sat a while by the fire, then crawled into my tent. The night was cool but not freezing, the kind of night where a sleeping bag keeps you perfectly comfortable. I fell asleep easier than I expected, but sometime deep into the night, I woke up to a sound that didn't fit with the ordinary rhythm of the woods. It wasn't the normal movement of raccoons or deer. It was heavier. A low crunch, deliberate, then silence, then another. Each one carried weight. My ears picked it up long before my brain caught up, and when I finally realized something big was moving near camp, I felt a tightness in my chest. I lay there in the dark, holding still, listening harder. The sound came from down near the bottom of the ridge. Slow, steady, moving across the slope. I tried to picture what it could be. Bear, elk, maybe even a moose. Whatever it was big enough to break branches and push through the undergrowth like it wasn't even there. The worst part wasn't just hearing it. It was the way it would stop. The noise would move for a bit, crunching through the forest floor, then fall silent. I'd hold my breath, straining to catch the smallest sound, and then, after what felt like forever, it would start again, closer. The pauses were almost worse than the movement. Felt like it was listening, just as much as I was. I stayed still until my body ached from the tension. At one point, the sound grew so near that I could picture it standing just yards from the tent. I didn't know if it knew I was there. The fabric felt like no protection at all. My mind spun with images of a bear ripping it open, or a bull moose stomping through, or something else just blundering into me. I didn't sleep again that night. I lay awake, every nerve on edge, listening to the steps come and go, shifting back and forth across the slope, sometimes moving off, sometimes circling close again. When dawn finally came, I felt a relief so deep it's hard to put into words. The thin light of morning crept through the trees, soft at first, then brighter, and the forest slowly came alive with birds. That normal noise of life returning was enough to steady me. I unzipped the tent cautiously, half expecting to see something waiting outside, but the clearing was empty. Still, I didn't linger. I packed my gear quickly, heart still beating hard, and set out up the ridge. The hike wasn't long, just half a mile, maybe a little more, but it felt endless. Every few steps, I'd stop to listen, convinced I'd hear the same heavy crunch behind me. My ears played tricks on me. A branch snapping far off sounded like footsteps. The breeze through the trees made me turn my head, sure something was there. The ridge climb was steep enough to burn my legs, but I hardly noticed. My focus was behind me the whole way. I must have looked over my shoulder more times in that short climb than I had in my entire life in the woods. My neck was sore from snapping my head back so often, my hands tight around the straps of my pack. Halfway up, I paused, crouched low, and just listened. My ears rang with the silence, but I thought I caught something, just the faintest sound of movement far below. I couldn't be sure if it was real or just my own nerves, but it pushed me forward faster. I climbed hard, my breath ragged, my shirt sticking to my back with sweat despite the cool air. By the time I reached the top of the ridge, my legs were shaking from more than just exertion. The climb hadn't been long, but the weight of fear made it feel like miles. When I finally stood at the crest, looking down the other side, I felt a wave of safety, as if the ridge itself had put a barrier between me and whatever had stalked the bottom. I don't think I've ever been so relieved to see the first light of day spilling across a stretch of untouched woods. I stopped there, breathing hard, looking back the way I'd come. From the top, the bottom of the ridge seemed quiet, normal, like nothing had ever been there. But I knew better. I had heard it. Something big moving slow, deliberate, stopping and listening, circling close in the dark. Maybe it had been a bear, curious but cautious. Maybe it was a moose, wandering clumsily through in the night. Or maybe it was something else altogether. I'll never know. What I do know is that the distance from the bottom to the top, barely over half a mile, felt like the longest stretch I've ever walked. I couldn't stop checking behind me, couldn't stop pausing to strain my ears. That climb was pure tension, my heart hammering the whole way. And when I finally reached the ridge line and looked out at the morning sun, it felt like the tightest grip of fear I'd ever carried had finally loosened. The woods have always felt like a second home to me, but that night taught me something I won't forget. The line between calm and terror out there is razor thin. One sound in the dark, one heavy step in the wrong place, can change the entire way you feel about being alone under the trees. When I hiked out later that day, I carried that memory with me. The relief of daylight, the sound of my own footsteps on solid ground, the simple comfort of distance between me and whatever had stalked the ridge. And even now, years later, when I think back to that trip, it isn't the campfire or the stars or the ridge views that come to mind. It's the sound in the night, the deliberate weight of something moving just out of sight, and the longest half mile of my life spent looking back over my shoulder. I went camping alone on a beach a few years ago, something I had always wanted to try. I liked the idea of falling asleep with the sound of waves in the background, the endless stretch of sand in every direction, and the solitude that came with it. It felt like a safe spot too, wide open with nowhere for animals to sneak up unnoticed. I hiked in late that afternoon, carrying my gear across the sand, and found a spot above the tide line where the sand was flat and dry. The ocean stretched out in front of me, the horizon turning gold and red as the sun went down, and for a while it was exactly what I had hoped for. Peaceful, empty, and quiet except for the steady crash of waves. I set up my tent facing the water, a small dome tent that had been through dozens of trips with me. I built a little fire from driftwood, cooked a simple dinner, and sat there watching the flames die down while the stars came out one by one. The night was cooler than I expected, but not cold. The ocean was loud, steady, almost soothing. I remember thinking how perfect it was to have a whole beach to myself. Eventually, I put out the fire, crawled into my tent, zipped the flap, and stretched out in my sleeping bag. The sound of the surf carried me quickly towards sleep. It's hard to describe how comforting it feels to be surrounded by that rhythmic noise, wave after wave hitting the shore. I remember rolling onto my side, half dreaming already, when I woke up suddenly a few hours later. My watch said it was just after 3 in the morning. At first, I didn't know why I had woken up. Then I heard it. A faint noise, not like the surf, not like the wind. It was soft, irregular, almost like something brushing against the fabric of the tent. I froze, listening. The ocean was loud enough that I couldn't be sure of what I had heard, but the sound stuck with me. It was gentle, just a faint dragging sound, as if fingers or fabric had slid across the side of the tent. I lay back down, telling myself it was probably the wind shifting the material, maybe sand being moved by the breeze. I let my eyes close again, but before I drifted off, I heard it once more, louder this time. I sat up quickly in my sleeping bag, heart already racing. The brushing noise stopped. The only thing I could hear was the constant crashing of the waves. I waited, holding my breath, straining to hear anything else. And then it happened. The walls of the tent started to press inward. Not from the wind, not from settling fabric. I could see the outlines clearly, shapes pressing in from the outside. The first push came from one side, then another from behind me, then both sides at once. They weren't quick jabs either. They were slow, deliberate presses, the flat shape of palms and fingers pushing against the fabric. I stared in shock, unable to believe what I was seeing. Hands, actual hands. The tent shifted as if they were testing it, pressing from all directions, and I could see the forms clearly outlined by the faint light from the moon and stars outside. It wasn't just one person. It was several surrounding the tent, pressing their hands in as if they were closing in on me. The sound of the ocean was all I heard. No laughter, no footsteps, no voices. Just those hands pressing in one after another. My body locked up with fear. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I didn't even breathe normally. I just held as still as possible, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. Those few seconds dragged on into what felt like an eternity. My mind raced through every possible outcome. I pictured the tent collapsing in on me, hands tearing it open, being dragged out onto the sand. The silence was the worst part. If it had been kids, I thought there would be noise, running, shouting, laughter. But there was nothing, just the sound of the ocean and the slow, steady pressure of hands pushing in. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The fabric of the tent shifted back into place. The pressure vanished. The night was silent again, apart from the waves. I sat frozen in the dark, every muscle in my body tensed, waiting for the next push. Minutes passed. I kept expecting it to happen again, but it didn't. My ears rang from how hard I was straining to listen. Eventually, when enough time had passed that I thought I might lose my mind just waiting, I forced myself to move. I reached slowly for my flashlight, flicked it on, and with shaking hands unzipped the tent flap just enough to poke my head out. The light cut across the sand. Nothing moved. The beach was empty, wide open in every direction, pale under the moonlight. My eyes darted across the dunes, down to the water, and back again. Nothing. But then I lowered the beam of light and saw them. Shoe prints, dozens of them, stamped clearly in the sand all around my tent. Some overlapping, some spaced apart, circling the entire camp. I stepped out fully and turned in a slow circle, the beam catching print after print. They were fresh, crisp in the sand, leading right up to the sides of the tent where I had seen the hands. I stood there for a long time, the ocean roaring behind me, the wind tugging gently at my shirt, flashlight beam bouncing across the beach. Whoever it had been was gone now, vanished into the night. The openness of the beach, which had seemed so safe earlier, now felt like exposure. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run that wouldn't leave me wide out in the open. I went back into the tent, zipped it up, and sat there clutching the flashlight, too terrified to even lie down again. Sleep was out of the question. I listened to the waves, every crash making me more anxious, because it masked any other sound. If they came back, I wouldn't hear them until they were right outside again. The hours until dawn stretched on endlessly. When the sky finally began to lighten, relief hit me so hard I almost felt sick. I unzipped the tent again as the first pale light touched the water. The footprints were still there, scattered in the sand, circling like evidence of a nightmare I had actually lived. I packed my gear in record time, every few seconds glancing over my shoulder, convinced I'd see someone standing just at the edge of the dunes. I don't know who they were. Maybe it really was kids sneaking around in the middle of the night, out to scare a lone camper. Maybe it was someone else entirely, someone who thought better of whatever they had planned once I didn't make a sound. I'll never know. All I know is that I've never been that scared in my life. The feeling of those hands pressing in from every direction, the silence except for the ocean, the prints proving I hadn't imagined it. It was enough to burn that night into my memory forever. And when I think back on it now, the scariest part isn't even the hands or the footprints. It's the silence. Whoever was out there never said a word, never made a sound, and then disappeared into the night. That kind of silence is worse than anything else. It meant they didn't want me to know who they were or what they wanted, and that unknown has stayed with me ever since. I went camping near Old Forge, New York this past summer, and even now, months later, I can still feel my chest tighten when I think about what happened that day. The area around Old Forge is known for its trails, dense woods, and the kind of quiet that makes you forget how close or far you are from anything. I had planned a simple overnight trip, nothing too far off the beaten path, but far enough that I could feel like I was alone with the woods. I had packed my tent, a sleeping bag, some food, and the usual camping gear, nothing special. That morning had been cool, with the kind of mist that clings to the trees and dampens every sound. I set out from the trailhead with the weight of my pack pressing down on me and the smell of pine heavy in the air. The trail wound along a low ridge, with stretches where you could see between the trees to dark pools of swampy water, and other stretches where the woods closed in so tightly you felt like you were walking down a hallway with green walls. By the time I had gotten a few miles in, I could feel the sweat sticking to my back, and I stopped a few times to drink water and catch my breath. The quiet of the forest was always something I thought I enjoyed, but out there, alone, it felt different. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me turn my head. I told myself it was just chipmunks or squirrels, but my eyes always searched for something bigger. I remember thinking about black bears because they're fairly common in that part of New York. Still, I had never seen one up close in the wild, and a part of me thought the chances were slim. When I got closer to the small camping area I had in mind, the ground leveled out, and I started to notice a faint smell, something sharp and sour, not unlike garbage. I assumed it was just swamp gas or something rotting in the underbrush, but the odor stuck with me as I walked. That smell grew stronger as I got closer to a clearing, and then I saw it. An old green dumpster sitting on the edge of a gravel service road, not far from where the trail cut across. The lid was open, and I could see trash bags spilling out of it, torn apart and scattered across the ground. That was when I froze. Not 30 feet away from me, standing near the dumpster, was a black bear. He was big, easily 250 to 300 pounds. His thick coat of fur looking almost glossy in the sunlight filtering through the trees. His shoulders shifted as he pawed through the garbage, lifting scraps of food and tossing them aside. For a second, I thought maybe he hadn't noticed me. I held my breath, willing my feet to stay still even though every instinct screamed at me to run. Then he stopped. His head lifted and he sniffed the air. Slowly, he turned his snout toward me. His eyes caught mine, dark and unreadable, and in that moment, the whole forest seemed to go silent. I could still hear the faint trickle of water somewhere off to my right, but the usual bird calls and rustles of small animals were gone. The bear shifted his weight, then began to move toward me. I took one careful step backward, my boot sinking into the soft earth. My pack felt heavier with every second, and I could feel the sweat building at the back of my neck. The bear's head swayed side to side as he sniffed, his nostrils flaring. When he was about halfway between me and the dumpster, he rose up on his hind legs. That image is burned into my mind. He looked enormous, towering over me, his chest broad and his claws extended slightly as if to show just how much power he had. My heart hammered so hard it hurt, and I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I forced myself not to turn and bolt. I remembered what I had read, that running would trigger a chase instinct. Instead, I slowly backed away, one step, then another. The bear stayed upright for what felt like forever, swaying slightly, sniffing at the air. His ears twitched, and I could see the muscles under his fur ripple as he adjusted his stance. My hands were trembling so badly I could hardly keep them steady at my sides. Finally, he dropped back down onto all fours with a heavy thud that seemed to shake the ground. He gave a deep, low huffing sound, and I thought my knees might give out right there. I kept moving backward, my eyes locked on him, making sure not to trip. Each step felt like it took a full minute, the distance between us closing and opening in my head like some nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I don't know how long it went on, maybe only a minute or two, but eventually he seemed to lose interest. He turned his head back toward the dumpster, pawed at another bag of trash, and tore it open. The sound of crinkling plastic echoed in the clearing. That was my chance. I kept backing away until the trees swallowed me again. then turned and moved as quickly and quietly as I could back down the trail. I didn't run, but I wanted to. Every sound made me think he was following me. Every shadow between the trees felt like it was about to move. I looked over my shoulder more times in that half-mile stretch than I have in my entire life in the woods combined. My chest was tight, my legs shaky, but I kept going, not stopping until I reached a safer distance. When I finally stopped, I leaned against a tree and tried to breathe. The forest sounds slowly returned. The chirps of birds, the rustle of squirrels, the creak of branches in the wind. It was like the woods had been holding their breath the whole time along with me. I stood there until I felt steady enough to walk again, then kept moving until I was well away from the clearing and the dumpster. That night, when I set up my tent farther down the trail, I couldn't shake the image of the bear standing there, towering over me, silent except for that low huff of breath. I barely slept, listening for every snap and shift outside the tent, my flashlight in my hand, my heart pounding at every sound. The next morning, with the daylight burning away some of the fear, I packed up and cut the trip short. I didn't want to pass that dumpster again, and I didn't trust myself to sleep another night out there alone. Looking back, I know I was lucky. The bear could have charged, could have easily closed that 30-foot gap before I had a chance to move. But he didn't. He just reminded me in the most terrifying way that out there in those woods, I wasn't in control. That's a lesson I'll never forget.